Good morning. I'm Steve. This is Pico. Okay, you figured it out. We're not going to do any introductions, partly because I think we all have so many questions we sincerely want to ask one another. I have met Steve only once, 33 years ago, in the back of a taxi in the Philippines. 33 years worth of questions on both sides. Paul is a really good friend and colleague, but I almost never get to see him. And we thought in order to make this as focused as possible, we would begin at least by talking about the border. And Paul, as you know, has a book coming out soon on the border. Steve has many, many images of border crossings around the world. And of course, these are Steve's images that are accompanying us as we speak. And for me, who's been traveling all my life, the natural first place to begin is to ask first Paul and then Steve, what's the hardest border crossing you can remember?
Can you all hear me? It's okay. The hardest one, I think, was probably Angola. And when people say it's a tough crossing, you always think people say it's not worth it. But I tend to think if it's very hard to get into a country, I tend to think or to wonder what they're hiding. And so instead of being put off by a difficult crossing of a border, I tend to think I want to do it. There must be something amazing on the other side. People say the Mexican border is difficult and dangerous. Actually, I found that one of the easiest. You can walk from any city in the United States to any city on the other side of the border, just stroll across, have a beer, and stroll back. That's not true for Mexicans, but for a gringo, it's the easiest thing in the world. And when people say it's dangerous, in my experience, it wasn't dangerous. Maybe I was lucky. The most difficult one was Angola, going from Namibia into Angola. Getting into Angola. No tourists go to Angola. Angola, is in Africa. It's in sort of the southwest part of Africa. There are no animals there. All the animals have been blown up with landmines or eaten during the war. So if you go there looking for lions, elephants, giraffe, you won't find them. There are some antelopes there, but there's nothing else. Tourists don't go. It's one of the most expensive countries in the world. Luanda, one of the most expensive cities in the world. When I got there, I couldn't believe how expensive it was for a hotel room. I couldn't get a visa. No one wanted me there. They don't want journalists, they don't want tourists, they don't want people. It's an oil-rich place, as you may know. So what I did was I volunteered as a teacher. I got the American embassy to approve my teaching, and then I had to physically go in. I went in on the ground. But when I went in, on the Namibian side, there were mobs of people, and I was with a guy. He said, "Be very careful. All these people are thieves." I was being jostled. And then, and this was after maybe a year of negotiating for a visa. And then when I actually got to it, I had to show a letter of introduction, a letter from the US Embassy, a letter from my bank saying I had enough money to support me. I had a whole sheaf. And the man said, he said, "I need photocopies." The guy at the border. I was treated very roughly, very rudely, but still thinking, I'm a traveler, I'm a tourist. What are they hiding? What is on the other side of this difficult frontier? To make a very long story short, I actually got there, being abused for being a foreigner, abused for even venturing in, and then I got there and I had to get to, Namibia is on the south, I had to go over, and then I had to get to a place called Lubango. I took a taxi. That's another saga. The story is told in my book, The Last Train to Zona Verde. I finally got there. And what they were hiding, obviously, was corruption, poverty, wasted money, wasted oil money, and a dictatorship that had been in power for 35 years. So, not a fun place, but a place to write about.
Yeah, that's something we should talk about later, but Steve.
For me, the most difficult border situation was I did a lot of work in Afghanistan in the late 70s and early 80s. I couldn't get a visa for Afghanistan, so I had to go to Peshawar and basically walk through the mountains into the Khyber Pass and walk into the mountains from there. I did that probably 15 or 20 times. I got arrested several times. Twice I was put in jail. One time was for 5 days. I was picked up, and they said, who are you? What are you doing here? And I said, I'm a photographer. So they kept me. They checked, I guess, with the embassy, and then after about the third day, they put me in leg irons. And I thought, this is taking a turn for the worse. This isn't going to end well. They wouldn't. They didn't give us any food. There was no bed. We had to give money to a guard to get us cookies and snacks. And after 5 days, then they let me go. And I thought, I'm definitely going to be expelled from Pakistan. I'm never going to be able to get back in. But we walked out of the prison, and we just kept, went back, and started working again. But it was, so I wasn't able to get a visa, and we didn't have permission from the Pakistanis to cross the border. So I had to dress up in a shalwar kameez, and I kind of dyed my hair black, and then we get in the back of a car and pretend like I was asleep. And then once we got to near the border, put my cameras into a duffel bag, a burlap bag, and walk with a group of these sort of Afghan mujahideen, and pray that nobody would detect me or see me. But then it was, so going from kind of the frying pan to the fire, then I was in this war zone, and then to get out of Afghanistan back into Pakistan, I was worried that they would arrest me coming back in, which they did, and then they would confiscate my film. So I figured, okay, I just risked my life to get these pictures. So I hid the film. I put some dummy film in the camera, and the exposed film I put in the seam of my shalwar kameez and different parts of my, in my socks and in my shirt, praying that they wouldn't find it, because I thought if they, after all that work, to have them take the film would be like they would kill me. So it worked, and I got it. And I remember one time.
Did they confiscate your film?
No, they never did. But one time I got some kind of amoebic dysentery, and we had to walk. There were no cars. You couldn't even have a bicycle, and so it was weeks up and down these mountains, up and down, up and down, up and down.
Describe your shoes, though.
Well, I wore an old pair of tennis shoes, which was a big mistake because I developed these big, huge blisters on the bottom of my feet. And it was, and it was so painful, but I just had to, there was no way just had to power through it. So I got this maybe dysentery. I remember dragging my ass up and down these mountains, trying to get back to the border. And then once I crossed the border into Pakistan, then it was the whole problem of, being detected and, who are you? Where's your passport? You don't have permission to be here. You're in a restricted area, and we're going to search you. We want to, And so that was the kind of the gauntlet I had to walk.
But they were the first pictures of Afghanistan that appeared in the New York Times.
Right.
But the New York Times didn't have a photographer there. Steve's pictures were 79, was it?
79, yeah.
Yeah, in 79, when the Soviets invaded, Steve's pictures were used. Pico, what's your most difficult?
In a curious way, I think of traveling between wakefulness and dreaming, between night and day, between spring and autumn, because I often think there's one word that came into the language the year before I entered the world: jet lag. And so many of us spend so much of our time there, and our politicians are making their most important decisions after flying across 16 time zones. And you all know this, we're in a sort of drug state, not exactly drug state, not exactly dream state, but real discombobulation state that no one's been before, where you don't even really know who you are or where you are. I once spent 2 weeks, of all things, living in Los Angeles airport, exercise and masochism, but watching people pass through border crossings. And then after that, I did a sort of sequel about jet lag and the crossings in our mind. But on a more terrestrial level, I mean, I think the border crossing has not just to do with the border, but who's crossing it. And of course, I have an advantage or mixed blessing that Steve and Paul don't, which is I look exactly like a terrorist. And I've lived in Japan for 32 years now, and I return maybe 4 times a year. And literally, every time, as soon as they saw me, they would pull me away and strip search me. They thought either I was Saddam Hussein's cousin, or I was an Iranian trying to immigrate illegally, and they had a big problem with that. Or worst of all, they thought I was what I really am, which is somebody from a poor country in Asia by ancestry. As soon as I was in Japan, they couldn't have been kinder and more gracious, but getting in there was difficult. And then one day, I was flying in from Hong Kong, and there was another person of Indian ancestry on the plane. And I said, "Does it happen to you?" And he looked at me as if I was a kindergartner. I said, "No, of course not, because if there are 15 customs lanes there, 14 are manned by men and 1 by a woman, always go for the one manned by a woman." And it's true, ever since I go to the customs lane manned by, and she always says, "Welcome to Japan, we're so happy to see you." You know, the more foreigners, the better. And just one final thing, because I don't want to go on, but my favorite country in the world is Japan, but my favorite society is Canada. And a few years ago, I wrote a book about why I think Canada is such an estimable place. And a few months after that, I was invited to go to Ottawa to talk about why I love Canada. Canadians are very good at not loving Canada. And it happened to be September 14th, 2001. And so all the planes were cancelled, as you remember. And finally, I could only go to Ottawa for 36 hours. So I just had to carry on. I arrived 3 days after a terrorist attack with almost nothing in my bag. They looked at me. I'd been in Yemen the previous month. I'd been in Syria and Jordan in recent months, taking my aging mother on a holiday, I should say. But as far as they were concerned, I'd been in all these bad countries. I fit the profile. Why was I suddenly arriving in Ottawa 3 days after a terrorist attack? They opened my carry-on, and I'd just been writing about my recent trip to Yemen, so there was a whole article about Yemen. And then, worst of all, my form of notation is, I grew up in England, so I do everything with indecipherable handwriting. And they saw my notes, and they thought I was writing in Arabic. And so my 36 hours in Ottawa mostly took place at the immigration, and the most tolerant, hospitable society on earth still can be a very hard place to enter. But I think that goes to the question I'd love to ask both of you, which is, do you think the world is getting more open or closed? Is traveling getting easier, more difficult?
What I've noticed in traveling for 50-odd years, I started traveling seriously in 1963 when I graduated from college, is that countries open, countries close. When my passport in 1963 said not valid for travel to Cuba and Albania, there was a page. Do you remember this? Some of you may remember. So it said not valid for travel to Albania. And naturally I thought, well, Cuba was a place I had wanted to go. Albania, I didn't even know where it was. So, but then Cuba has opened to travel. Albania opened in 89, 90. I actually went to Albania. I must say Albania was one of the strangest countries I've ever seen. Beyond anything I'd seen in the developing world. Small, paranoid, and just strange for being sealed off from the world. But we were talking about a little earlier about Syria. I had some wonderful experiences in Syria, in Aleppo and Damascus in '95 when I was writing a book called The Pillars of Hercules. And now you really cannot go to Syria. The same is true. Steve was in Afghanistan in 77?
79.
79?
Yeah.
I was there in 73. I thought kind of rough and ready, but an amazing place. I took a bus from Iran and then to the train to the border, and then a bus, Herat, Kandahar, all the places that you hear about as war zones. Afghanistan was a place where everyone went to buy hashish and to hang out. It was a hippie paradise. Everyone had a gun. The answer to your question is, the world is obviously changing, but countries are opening and countries are closing. They're closing down. So if you have a yen, I was in Singapore in the late 60s. I thought, I'll go to Cambodia. I can always go to Angkor Wat. And then Cambodia closed and I couldn't go. Eventually I did get there, but for a long time, years of Pol Pot, you couldn't go to Cambodia. Impossible, impossible. So the world is shrinking in many ways, but the no-go zones are multiplying too. And so if you have a yen to go somewhere, go, because it's possible that it won't be easy to go there, in a year or two. There might be a war. Iran, lovely country. I had interesting experiences there. Now, I tried to go there a few years ago. I couldn't go. I think so. We all have this. I mean, is the world improving or not? If you've lived the past 50 years, you see politically maybe improving, environmentally terrible. Obviously, this is a planet that is getting worse by the year. I mean, this planet is doomed. But so we won't see it, our grandchildren. But I don't know what that answers. What do you think, Steve?
It does.
Yeah. Well, yeah. When I started traveling, places like Cambodia were off limits. I was there in '86 with Dith Pran and Hang Nor from the movie The Killing Fields, and there was not one tourist in Siem Reap. If you go back now, it's Mogadishu was open back in the late '70s, and Cuba, which was still have a restriction. I think you have to go there for educational reasons. I just go anyway. I don't care. But when I started traveling, Russia and China were really difficult to travel to, which is, I think, in large part why I went to India.
Well, it was impossible to go to China through the 60s and 70s. I mean, during the Cultural Revolution, it was impossible. And then, so a bit late, I first went in 1980, and it was a totally different country. I mean, but you remember trying to get into China, and it was absolutely forbidden.
Yeah. And a place like Burma, which 30 years ago you could hopefully maybe just get like a 1-week visa.
Yeah.
And now it's a major tourist destination.
Yeah.
It was really fascinating back in the 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But what about you, Pico?
And also, these restrictions are so capricious. I mean, as I heard Paul's passport story, I was remembering as a little boy I had an Indian passport, and there it was inscribed, you're not allowed to go to Portugal. So to this day, I've never set foot in Portugal, even though for 50 years I've had British and American. Goa and some bad feelings of past. I mean, all these strange, random grievances and grudges they carry.
But there's another aspect. I applied for an Indian visa about 3 or 4 years ago, and I filled out the application. I put it in, and I thought, quick turnaround, and the consulate said after a week I still get it back. 2 weeks later I couldn't get it back. And they said, what's the problem? And they said, you wrote occupation writer on your application. I said, what's the problem? They said it has to go to a higher authority because you put down writer.
But they do the same thing with photographers. So what I do now is I don't put photographer, I just put retired. Everywhere.
No, I do too. And they say retired from what? I say, I was a geography teacher.
Yeah.
And retired.
Yeah.
I just met somebody on a boat, and her passport photo, she was an Anglican cleric. So she was denied entry to China recently, but even more surprisingly, she couldn't get into India because they said, you're a Protestant. Doesn't make sense. And India's meant to be the most multi-denominational place around. But also then, I remember I've been recently to places like Iran and North Korea, and I have an American and a British passport, and I was told you have to use an American to get into them, which is a little counterintuitive, but then you remember that Britain has 300 or 700 years of bad history of those places, and America just 40, and Americans are actually looked on more favorably than the Brits.
I was going to make an observation about crossing a border, which is that there's 2 ways that you can cross a border. One is you cross like Alice in Wonderland, where you cross and you're very small. The other is you cross and you're a big gringo, And I think the most sensible way of crossing is realize that you're very small, that crossing a border should remind you that you're really insignificant. And Flaubert once said, travel shows us how small we are, how big the world is, how small we are, and that when you cross a border, you should get small, study the culture, and realize that you really are very unimportant. You're not there to throw your weight around, but crossing a border, you should shrink. You shrink, not mentally, but you should feel humble, feel as if you're studying the culture, and that there has to be a change in attitude, that you can't go thinking, I'm a writer, tell me a story, or whatever it is, that you really have no rights, and you need to negotiate. I come from a very large family of 7 children, so I always had to negotiate at the table in the house, with whatever it was to do. Is this all right with you? Are you sure that's all right? The only child tends to take the last cookie on the plate. But if you come from a large family and someone shows you a plate with 1 cookie on it, you don't take it. You say, are you sure you don't want it? Would you like it? And the cookie stays on the plate in a big family as you negotiate. So negotiating is another aspect of border crossing, I think.
As I hear that, though, I'm also thinking you and I have an advantage that Steve doesn't, which is that we're very portable. You presumably are carrying cameras, and it's hard to be invisible. And
yeah, that's true.
Yeah, no, I can. I mean, I can say I'm retired, but I still have this big bag of camera equipment, which has to be explained in many cases.
Yeah.
But I just say, it's my hobby. It's, what I try to kind of. But it's surprising how many hobbyists have better equipment than I do. Dentists and people, whatever. So I just, I have to. It can be a problem.
I've also always imagined it's hard to check in. I mean, sometimes do you have a lot of equipment and you have to pay extra?
Yeah, well, the worst part was when I had film, and I would go into a country with, say, 300 rolls of film, and they look at that. The customs guy is looking at me like I'm a smuggler, or what's inside. And then coming out through the X-ray machine was even worse because they wanted to X-ray everything. So it was a constant battle. Now with digital, of course, you don't have that problem. But
do you know it just occurred to me too that of the different ways of crossing a border, one is flying to the capital. Normally, you fly to the capital and you get off, and that your first experience of the country is leaving the airport or being in the airport and then leaving and being in the capital city. But the other, which is much more frequent for me, and I'm sure you guys, is crossing the physical border of the country, being at the very, very edge of the country. I was at the edge of Syria, the edge of Afghanistan, the edge of Mexico. And being on the Mexican border tells you nothing about Mexico, nothing. The border is owned by the cartels, mainly. The border can be very dangerous. It's very iffy. But the border culture is fascinating and complicated. There's special language on the Mexican border, the music, the stories. That's all distinct from what you would find in Mexico City. So, but the border of, say, crossing a border from Ethiopia into Kenya is just a dusty, empty riverbed. From Kenya to Uganda, it's nothing. It's just sand. It's just nothing. I told about the Angola border was indistinguishable. One side looked just like the other. There's no fence. There was a border post that you go through. But going through the border, you're going from one place to another. Actually, stepping from one country, walking across the border. Because in most of the places I can think of, you walk across. You're not on you might be on a train, but usually you're on a bus, you get off the bus, and you walk across, or in a car, you walk across. So it's different. So entering a country is different when you're entering on the frontier.
And that's why one often travels by train or bus or foot even, because you're seeing things in a much more intimate human way. And
I was making that journey from Afghanistan back to Delhi to ship my film. and I wasn't feeling well. I was still in the dirty shalwar kameez. I got to Wagah border between Lahore and Amritsar, and I'm really, tired. I gave the guy my passport. He says, "Where's your yellow fever certificate?"
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, "Oh my God!" And he says, "You're going to have to go back to Lahore to get that, that shot." He says, "But maybe we can
Settle something here.
I promise you." The guy pulls his drawer out with a syringe, with a needle in his drawer, and I had a decision to make. Do I run the risk of, And I said, give me the shot, man. As he pulls the drawer out, I'm already so sick, it doesn't matter. But I literally got that shot. He just pulled out his desk drawer, and there was a syringe.
But I think of where's your yellow fever certificate as a request for a bribe. I mean,
I hadn't
in
thought of that.
every time I've ever asked for, I'm thinking of African countries in general crossing a border. Where's your yellow fever? Sit down. Maybe we can work something out.
But you were in Indonesia, flying into Indonesia, and your visa or your passport was close to being expired, and
Yeah.
the guy came back and back and forth, and eventually it became clear that he wanted.
Yeah, he said, I'm going to put you on the... flying into Bali, paradise of Bali, my passport was going to expire within 3 months. And so it's not... The stamp isn't valid. Anyway, it's kind of pretext. Took me into a room, and then it was sort of... he said, I'm going to put you on the next plane to Kuala Lumpur. I said, that would be very inconvenient because my wife has just gone through customs with all our luggage. And he said, well, I can do that to you. Anyway, a long story short, it was for a mordida. So he wanted, as they say. But that happens.
But you gave him the bakshish.
Some countries do not function without bribes, and India is one of them. Yeah. And the Middle East, bakshish was pretty common. Yeah. Mexico, the police, the usual. I was driving I thought it would be very interesting to drive from my home in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, to Mexico City. So I drove, and without too much fuss, I came to McAllen, Houston, McAllen, and then Reynosa, then Monterrey, Saltillo, Mexico City. The only problem I had was with the police. So that's the other factor of going across, is that it's culturally different. So I was stopped by the police. I have Massachusetts license plate on my car. The spirit of Massachusetts, spirit of America, it says on it. And so I was stopped 4 times, and the usual request was for $300, actually. Yeah. And I said, soy pensionado. Soy viejo gringo, pensionado. I'm a retired person. No tengo dinero. And he said, go to an ATM. I don't have the money. But that's it's the other aspect of crossing over, to understand that the police are likely to, they're underpaid, and they see a person in a reasonably nice car, likely suspect. I had no problem with on the border, though. Steve and I crossed from Tijuana to Matamoros, actually on the border, back and forth, without incident, I think.
Right.
Yeah. About, 3 years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also, I think it's kind of a reminder of the unfailing rule of travel, which is the more inefficient the country, the more they demand crazy efficiency from every visitor. I mean, India produces the best IT scientists in the world. It's almost impossible to get online there. But when you get into India, they say, please fill this 63-page form with every certificate you've ever had and your grandfather's death certificate and the like. Whereas a place like Singapore, where everything runs very well, you just, more or less go there, and you don't even have to do a disembarkation card nowadays. So
apropos borders too, there are people who live on the border. I mean, on the border of Kenya and Ethiopia, for example, or the border of, say, the Mexican border. And people who live on the border aren't like the people in the interior of the country. They're at the edge. Even, I suppose, in the United States, this is true. You're interesting. I didn't know that you were a Canadian enthusiast, but it's a lovely country. My ancestors came from there a long time ago. But isn't it also true that people who live, say, in Montana on the Canadian border have a different mindset from people living in the lower, part of the middle of the country?
And as you were saying in your talk yesterday, we forget hundreds of thousands of people going back and forth.
Oh, yeah.
Even between China and North Korea, the people living right next to North Korea have a whole different way of thinking.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands of Mexicans come to the States every day to work. They cross the border. It's a normal thing. They have an identity paper. They come across. Donald Trump doesn't know this, but the whole border is fun. They clean bedrooms. They make tacos. They work in service stations. They're doctors. They're dentists that go back and forth. In Arizona, for example, I mean, there are dentists in Nogales who live in Green Valley, or they have a practice on both sides of the border, and just the border is something that they drive across every day, and they get in a line of cars and they go, and at night they go back. It's not a knife edge, and in fact, in my experience, no border is a knife edge. It's a very blurred thing with its own set of rules.
Now, I want to take it a little differently, because there's a question I've been wanting to ask the two of you forever, because you have an unusual working relationship. So, like both of you, much of my travel has been done on assignment for magazines. And there are photographers I've been working with for 30 years, and I'm really grateful for, they amplify and deepen my piece with the beautiful imagery. But I always try to make sure I travel separately from the photographer. If she wants to be out at 5 in the morning and then stops at 5 in the evening. She wants to linger for 2 hours in this one moment. I want to go down an alleyway that's extremely unpicturesque. Her needs are different from mine. But the two of you travel together and work together. How do you make that happen?
We've a lot of these places on the border, we've actually separate, and Paul go, and sometimes we're together, walking through these towns, have the same fixer or whatever, but sometimes Paul will go off on his own, I go off on my own, make my pictures.
Or I might meet someone and say, I just met this person who does whatever he does, makes something. Might be interesting, and you take that picture,
right?
Or you meet someone and you say, "I just met someone." So we drive together, and sometimes separate. We also don't spend all the time together. That on the border, sometimes we're together, sometimes we're apart. But we like each other. I admire Steve's work enormously. You can see the pictures, huh? Are these brilliant pictures?
Oh,
yeah. So that's. This is from Reading.
Yeah.
I wrote the introduction to this book, Reading. These are all people reading. So Steve sees someone reading, he takes a picture. He's been doing this for how long?
Oh, since 40 years.
40 years.
Yeah.
And there's a book, you could buy the book on reading. What's my point? That
He's a great photographer.
Yes. So I have nothing but. This is not like traveling with photographers that you go. You're going with jobbing photographers who are on assignment and they're doing the thing. Steve has devoted his whole life as an independent person, not connected to a university. He's not a photographer in residence. He doesn't have a job. I'm unemployed myself. Steve has all his life is just Steve and a camera. Steve and a camera. That's how he made his living. No, he hasn't had a MacArthur Genius Grant. Am I right?
Yet.
Not yet. Yeah, I haven't had one. Both of us are working people, and we're not connected with. We live off campus. We're not connected to. Steve gives lectures. I give lectures at universities now and then. But we're self-supporting older gentlemen doing our job. And so look at these pictures. That's Afghanistan. That's probably Afghanistan too.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So when you travel with someone whose work you admire, You may or may not admire these people. I've traveled with those photographers too. I just go separately. And but Steve and I started traveling together in the early 1980s, so that's a long time.
Long time.
And his work has enhanced. I wrote a book about the South, Deep South. Steve's pictures were in it. Mexico, ditto. And I know when Steve was sick in India, he was reading my book.
Yeah, I was in an old British hill station called Kodi Canal near Madurai and near Madras, Chennai. And again, another case where I was sick in bed, and at the school I was visiting, they had a copy of the Great Railway Bazaar, and I read it, the whole thing just straight through, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. Because Paul went from London, India, China, Russia, back to London. And I thought, first of all, it was an incredible journey, incredibly written. But I thought, this could be, because I was traveling by train all over India, second class. In fact, I had gotten to Kodi Canal on the train from Delhi. It was like 2 or 3 days. And I thought, I'm going to photograph this. So I actually made a proposal, gave it to a magazine, and they gave the writing assignment to Paul, who had already, of course, had a lot of experience in Indian trains. So that was was our first collaboration. But we were in Costa Rica together. And
How's your job changed with the advent of digital, with the changing of magazines? The photography has changed more than many fields in the last 40 years.
Well, the assignments used to be longer. There's more money. There's more. You could get lost on assignment for weeks or months.
Because magazines existed.
Yeah.
Same with writing.
And now they don't.
Writing existed once upon a time.
I mean, you as readers can testify to the fact that the shrinking magazine market, there are fewer magazines, fewer travel magazines, fewer magazines. Time and Newsweek used to be the magazine. They hardly exist now. But when I lived in Africa, I used to get Time magazine. I used to read Time magazine all the time, and then eventually I began writing for it. And you wrote for it too.
A long time, yeah.
Yeah.
But there are also, now everyone's keeping a blog, but even more, everyone's a travel photographer, right?
Oh,
the
yeah.
number of photographs in the last 2 years is the same as in all of human history, I think. So how does somebody with a real eye like you distinguish yourself from the millions of others, of us?
Well, I look at all these pictures the same way people are texting, and what people are writing often is not great literature, and a lot of the pictures that are floating around are just pictures of people, having lunch with a friend or whatever. So I think that it's changed dramatically, but I think that working at a particular level with a lot of experience, I think people can look at a picture and decide.
I can say though that there are days when Steve doesn't take a picture when we're traveling, and I remember traveling through Mississippi, and I said, "What do you think?" He said, "The light's wrong." What about that? No, and just sitting, and I can imagine an amateur photographer saying, "Hey, there's just snapping. I'm going to put that on my Instagram, or gee, I took a pic for my lunch and take of my taco or whatever it is." But Steve doesn't do that. Steve is he sees something that he wants, and he doesn't make a picture, but he sees it, and the light has to be right, and you can see from the pictures that are being shown here that these are pictures taken by someone who knows exactly what he wants, and who's patient. And there's a famous picture that Steve took of the Taj Mahal with a steam train in front of it. And how many days did you?
I was like 5 days.
5 days waiting for the train to come in to match with the Taj Mahal in the background. And that train line doesn't exist anymore, does it?
No.
So.
And that's another advantage you and I have, which is if the light is horrible and it's pouring with rain, we can write about that.
Yeah, we can write about it.
There's
But
nothing
I
we
was going
can't
to say,
write about.
but people with a blog, what I noticed, the bloggers, it's just indiscriminate writing. It's just blah, 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 and blah, blah. And I think of, writing as a formal exercise. It's not blah, 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 but it's actually that you're writing a sentence and you're making the sentence to a paragraph, and then you create a new paragraph, and there has to be a transition between them. It's not bloody, 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 blah, blah, but it's actually and I write in longhand anyway. I use a pen. I'm not doing this all the time. I think of it, writing as one of the plastic arts, that you're actually writing. And you would denigrate your handwriting, but I'm sure your handwriting is very interesting.
And I do everything in longhand too.
Yeah.
So you're right, that's an interesting distinction.
It's different from just hitting the keys. I hit those keys. And I think if there's something wrong with the world now, it's this, that there's no forethought. The forethought that Steve puts into taking a picture, or someone writing on a piece of paper.
So we have 3 minutes and 55 seconds left. And somebody yesterday at my session asked me a really good question that now I'll turn to both of you, which is, which are the places you haven't been that you long to go to? Steve? Sorry to...
No, I'm going to do a short little video. Since I'm a photographer, I'm going to do... I'd like to go to North Korea. I'd like to go to Iran. I'm really nervous about going to Iran. Being a photographer, being an American. I mean, I could go there and have an exhibition, but I don't want to go to Iran unless I can photograph.
Yeah.
And I'm nervous about walking around the streets of, say, Tehran or...
Don't be. I went with a photographer. I mean, we took separate trips, and wonderful.
Yeah.
The best country I've ever been in, actually.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
I'm
a couple
very
of years
excited.
ago.
It's just that I'm, have to find the right time and the right situation. But so I think I would say Iran for me would be at the top of my list right now.
Good
It's
choice.
at the bottom of my list. North Korea is at the bottom of my list. Most cities are at the bottom of my list. A place I've always wanted to go is Greenland. And I paddle kayak, I sail. I would like to paddle in the little corners of Greenland. I'd like to go trekking there. I'd like to see, it's an enormous place. It's not a place that you read anything about, but I've read the literature. Nansen crossed Greenland. There are a number of expeditions. Very early one by a man called Elijah Kane. In the middle of the 19th century, he was there. So it would be not... I find urban life nasty. Tehran, very nasty. In terms of traffic, mobs of people. The place I'd like to go, well, would be Alaska. I had a little glimpse of Alaska. I'd like to see more of it. A big, empty, beautiful country is what I would go for. To just free my mind. I live in Hawaii half the year, and it's very beautiful. To find a place more beautiful than Hawaii is difficult. But North Korea, no. My son was there, and he made a documentary about it.
I mean, there's certain places I like to go for kind of non-photographic reasons, but if I was going to go to work, the problem with Alaska is it's for me, when I think of Alaska, I think of landscapes, I think of bears, I think of working in a helicopter, a small plane, and none of that interests me. I would like to go there as maybe as a tourist for a few days, but not to photograph.
When I went to Alaska, I thought, why don't they put a fence around it? A fence around Alaska, and with a little door saying, we're not going to let you in unless you sign this agreement that you're not going to litter, you're going to be a good person. That it's the last great unspoiled place. And then I thought, well, of course you can't do that, but wouldn't it be nice?
Northern Greenland has a population of 40, and the space is larger than France and Japan combined. So I think it's awaiting your pen. But we were not going to have time to talk about it, but you mentioned it twice, the really interesting notion. You live in a beautiful place, and I think both of us do too. But often the places we seek out as writers and photographers are the least pleasant places. And because they're richer, they're more textures, there's much more to do with them often. The place I most want to go to, since we have 18 seconds left, is Mississippi. So I wish we could trade. I wish you could go to Iran and I could go to the Mississippi that you both shared. But thank you very much for sharing this time with us.